For many Americans, Venezuela feels distant. Another troubled country, another failed state, another foreign crisis that never seems to end. But when Donald Trump placed Nicolas Maduro at the center of U.S. foreign policy pressure, it was not emotional, ideological, or impulsive. It was economic, strategic, and rooted in a hard reality that most headlines fail to explain. This story is not primarily about socialism versus capitalism. It is not about personalities. And it is not even about Venezuela alone. It is about oil, monetary power, geopolitical leverage, and how economic collapse turns nations into strategic liabilities or strategic opportunities. To understand why Trump targeted Maduro, you must understand what Venezuela represents in economic terms, and why the status quo became unacceptable from a U.S. strategic perspective. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America. Its oil wealth made it a key supplier to the United States. Its proximity mattered. Its reserves mattered. Its stability mattered. Oil was the foundation of Venezuela's economy, government revenue, and geopolitical relevance. But oil wealth alone does not guarantee prosperity. It amplifies policy choices, good or bad. Over time, Venezuela chose centralized control over productivity. Nationalization replaced investment. Political loyalty replaced competence. Oil revenue was consumed instead of reinvested. When prices were high, the system survived. When prices fell, the system collapsed. By the time Nicolas Maduro consolidated power, Venezuela was already fragile. What followed was not a sudden disaster, but an acceleration of long-term decay. Collapsing production, hyperinflation, currency destruction, capital flight, and mass emigration. From an economic standpoint, Venezuela ceased to function as a normal oil state. It became a paradox. Enormous reserves, minimal output. Why that became a U.S. problem. For decades, the United States tolerated Venezuela's decline. Sanctions were imposed. Diplomatic pressure was applied. But tolerance has limits when strategic conditions change. Three developments made Venezuela impossible to ignore. First, global energy markets tightened. Energy security returned as a national priority. Supply disruptions, geopolitical conflict, and underinvestment made oil once again a strategic asset, not just a commodity. Second, Venezuela increasingly aligned with U.S. rivals. China and Russia expanded influence through loans, infrastructure deals, and oil-backed agreements. Venezuela became a geopolitical foothold for competing powers in the Western Hemisphere. Third, Venezuela's collapse destabilized the region. Millions fled. Criminal networks expanded. State failure created spillover effects that no amount of sanctions could contain. At that point, Venezuela stopped being just a humanitarian crisis. It became a strategic failure. Trump's approach, economics first. Donald Trump does not approach foreign policy as a moral project. He approaches it as a transactional one. His worldview prioritizes leverage, resources, and outcomes. From that perspective, Maduro represented three unacceptable conditions simultaneously. 1. An oil-rich state incapable of producing oil. 2. A hostile regime aligned with U.S. competitors. 3. A collapsing economy exporting instability. Trump's logic was not subtle. Venezuela was sitting on one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth while being economically non-functional. That contradiction was not just inefficient, it was strategically intolerable. In Trump's framework, failed states rich in critical resources are not neutral. They are liabilities waiting to be exploited by rivals. Oil as leverage, not charity. Much of the public discussion around Venezuela frames oil access as exploitation. That framing misses the economic reality. Oil does not generate wealth unless it is extracted, refined, sold, and reinvested. Under Maduro, Venezuela's oil sector was effectively paralyzed. Infrastructure decayed, expertise fled, output collapsed. From a purely economic perspective, Venezuela's oil wealth was dead capital. Trump's interest was not ideological, it was functional. An oil-rich country producing little oil is not sovereign in any meaningful sense. It is hostage to its own dysfunction. In Trump's view, restoring oil output was not optional. It was the prerequisite for any economic stabilization, for Venezuela and for regional energy markets. Why sanctions alone failed. Sanctions are slow tools. They apply pressure, but they rarely produce structural change unless paired with internal reform or external leverage. In Venezuela's case, sanctions restricted revenue but did not change behavior. The regime adapted. Informal markets expanded. Smuggling increased. The population suffered while power structures survived. Economically, sanctions froze a broken system rather than fixing it. Trump's critique of sanctions was consistent. Pressure without resolution creates permanent limbo. From his perspective, Venezuela had been stuck in limbo for too long. Trump's strategy toward Maduro followed a clear economic logic. 1. Remove political control blocking economic function. 2. Restore oil output under enforceable rules. 3. Cut rival influence from a critical resource base. 4. Stabilize regional energy supply. And 5. Convert a failed state into a functional one. This was not about rebuilding Venezuela as a model democracy. It was about restoring economic reality. Critics argue this approach ignores sovereignty. Trump's response would be simple. Sovereignty without function is symbolic. An economy that cannot sustain itself is already compromised. Why this matters to Americans. For American viewers, the Venezuela story is not distant. It reflects broader truths about economics and power. Energy remains foundational. Countries that control energy supply shape inflation, trade balances, and geopolitical stability. Failed energy states create volatility that affects prices at the pump, retirement portfolios, and global markets. Venezuela also illustrates how ideology can destroy productive capacity faster than external enemies ever could. No invasion destroyed Venezuela's economy. Policy did. And finally, the case highlights a reality often ignored in polite discussions. When states collapse economically, they invite intervention, financial, political, or strategic. Trump did not target Maduro because of rhetoric. He targeted Maduro because Venezuela represented a broken economic asset in a competitive world. This is not a defense or a condemnation. It is an explanation. In a world defined by scarce resources, rising competition, and fragile supply chains, economic dysfunction is not neutral. It creates vacuum, and vacuums are filled. Venezuela's tragedy is not that it was targeted. It is that it became targetable. Understanding Trump's actions toward Maduro requires abandoning moral simplifications and focusing on economic structure. This was about oil that could not flow, about an economy that could not function, about a region that could not stabilize itself. Trump acted not as an ideologue, but as a strategist responding to economic failure. Whether one agrees with the approach or not, the logic is clear. In global economics, prolonged dysfunction is never ignored forever. It is eventually confronted.